Good evening, everyone. I'm Kim Knox, president of the League of Women Voters of San Diego. I'd like to welcome you here this evening. Thank you for coming out. We're excited to be able to check out this wonderful new space. And I'd like to introduce Jane Andrews, our events chair.
Thank you. Okay, can people hear? Because we don't have a mic, so I'll just project as best I can. So, boy, it's really exciting to see a few people in person that I don't think I've ever seen in person, you know? And it's just exciting to all be together. And so I just want to say a word of thanks to Dean Carol Patton, Dean of the Social Sciences Department here at UCSD, who opened this up for our meeting tonight. So I want to say a word or two about format. We're going to do, Thad is going to speak for 20, 30 minutes, and then we are going to have the traditional league question and answer, which is the index cards. And so there should be index cards spread around. So think of some good questions and write them down, and I will come around and collect them. We have plenty of cards, and then Kim will moderate the Q&A. So let me just say a word about Thad. I want to say when I mentioned Thad Kousser at one of our events meetings, some of our longtime league people said, "Oh, he's so good at election debriefing." So I lined him up last summer for this event, and I'm very glad I did. So he has been a professor of political science here at UCSD since 2003. He served as chair from 2016 to 2022. He is now the co-director of the Yankelovich Center, and he's also a professor of political science. The Yankelovich Center is dedicated to connecting UCSD with the community to craft practical solutions to our nation's most pressing problems. Thad studies American state and national politics, voting reforms, direct democracy, and how politicians use social media. He's written numerous books. He comments on politics for venues such as NPR and the New York Times, and we're delighted to have you speak with us.
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. Thanks so much to all of you for coming out. Welcome to the Public Engagement Building. Congratulations on finding a parking spot. That is no easy trick, as any UCSD undergraduate will tell you. We're thrilled to have you here. I was just texting a picture of this to Dean Patton because she loves to see members of the community come to a space that is designed to bring UCSD faculty, students, graduate students into communication with the community. So thanks for being here for what we originally billed as a post-election post-mortem. But when I was checking CNN before I left, and they were having election night continued, was what they were. We're not going to be able to exactly determine where we are, but we all know what didn't happen on Tuesday night, right? We were expecting a red wave, and Colin just came up with it. We had a red droplet. I think that was what we saw. We're trying to see what the size of that droplet is, and that's what the next few weeks will be about. There will be contention in making that determination, especially when it comes to Arizona, where we have a candidate in Kari Lake who has not pledged to concede defeat. And we had some election irregularities in Maricopa County where people were able to cast their ballot. Their ballots will be counted, but they were not able to be immediately read by machines. On the other hand, as many of you know, how many of you have ever worked as a polling place worker? Right, so excellent. How long were these lines?
I was over at Doyle, and our line was 3 hours. Wow.
How long were the lines? How long were the lines here at UCSD?
4 hours on Tuesday, on average, yeah.
But didn't they reduce the number of places to vote?
Well, so we can talk about that. We can talk about the changes that have come to the way we cast ballots, radical changes that were underway before the pandemic, but were accelerated with the pandemic, and what those effects have been broadly. And at the end of the day, what the point that I think all of this shows is that there are always obstacles to voting. There are always focused in some neighborhoods and not others, right? So in Maricopa County, they're making an argument that in the Republican areas they had this problem. Here it was in areas where students and young people were voting. And so they can always bring potential for bias. Elections officials are always working on them. But overall, we had, yet again, a free and fair election. We had an election in which concession speeches were made, even on Tuesday night, even by prominent officials, including the Secretary of State and governor's candidates in Michigan, who had denied that Joe Biden won the 2020 election. That was something that I couldn't quite have hoped for a week ago, right? So we don't know exactly who will win every single seat, but I think a big picture theme of this election is democracy won. We carried out an election under really challenging circumstances, where there have been threats against county elections clerks, potential for violence against precinct workers, people like Jeannie, and we got through it without that. So there may be some controversies, but I think even though we're all waiting with bated breath to find out exactly which Senate seat flipped which way, where the House seats are, what's going on with Mike Levin, I think we can also all breathe a sigh of relief that we've moved through an election that was done in an orderly fashion, and that most of the candidates who lost by large margins have accepted that defeat in the grand tradition and norms of American democracy. But back to that red wave. Why were we expecting a red wave, right? And we can talk about the economy, and we can talk about Joe Biden, but even if Joe Biden was a popular president polling over 50%, even if the economy was humming along for everyone, we would have expected in a normal midterm year for the president's party to lose, and this is the average of the last half century, for the president's party to lose about 25 seats in Congress and about 3 seats in the Senate. That is just the natural instinct of voters to balance power, right? To engage in the governing scheme of the United States, which is about checking ambition against ambition and dividing power, dividing control between separated powers. That's part of what drives it. And it's also the natural inclination of voters to blame the party in power for whatever's going wrong, because there are always things going on in life. So you see that happen in American midterm elections. You see it also happen. My first academic paper looked at European Parliament elections that are sort of Europe's version of midterms, right? They don't have congressional elections. They just have a prime minister. The European Parliament elections come in during the middle of some prime minister's term, and the people always vote against the party of their local prime minister. But they vote more so when the economy is lagging. And the economy, by the measure of inflation, was lagging. Now, we had a jobs report the month before the election that showed unemployment was at the lowest level in 50 years. So the economy was working very well for many people. But unemployment, when it's historically low, it's say 3.5%, as it was in that report, rather than about 5%, which is about average, that makes life a lot better for 1.5% of the people. But inflation makes life a lot worse for everyone. And you saw that in poll after poll after poll. And in fact, if you looked at consumer, not just political polls, but the even better, dare I say it, polling done by economists in the Bureau of the Census and the Bureau of Labor Statistics, looking at consumer sentiment this year was worse than it was at any point during the Great Recession. Right, think about that. We had the biggest economic downturn since the Depression, and people were not as pessimistic as consumers as they were in this year. In fact, the only time in the history of that data set that we've seen consumer sentiment this low was in the late 70s, when there was massive inflation under Jimmy Carter. So inflation has this broad effect on the whole electorate, which really dampened the economic mood. And people took that out on Joe Biden with his approval ratings. And his approval ratings were low. They were lower than any president in a midterm election in modern history, except for, well, Donald Trump in 2018. Right? It was, so I think the 538 average was about 42% for Joe Biden and about 39% for Donald Trump at this time. Right? And Ronald Reagan, and they're about the same as where Ronald Reagan was in 1982. Ronald Reagan took an average loss, about 23, 25 seats. Donald Trump took a much larger loss. If you look at Democrats, Joe Biden was polling worse than Barack Obama was when he took, in his own words, the shellacking of 2010. And he lost 63 seats in Congress. So that's what happened in Congress in 2010, 63 seats with a more popular president. And we didn't, in an economic crisis that was terrible and broad and widespread, but had not dampened consumer confidence nearly as much as this. And it wasn't just the presidents, it wasn't just Congress that turned red in 2010. If you looked across state legislatures, where I do most of my focus, 21 of the 98 partisan state houses, state legislative chambers, flipped from blue to red in 2010. This was a massive loss of political control that actually put the Democrats way behind the Republican Party in American politics for the next decade. Because what do those state legislators who were elected in 2010 get to do? You're drawing it. They got to draw maps, and they drew a set of gerrymanders that made it that created what we call bias, right? In the seats to vote curve, right? Democrats could win 51, 52, 53% of the overall congressional vote throughout the 2010s, but still not win a majority of seats, right? There was a built-in bias. This year, we'll have to see till we get to all the votes counted to see what the total congressional vote was and the total seats in Congress. We've got a long way to go, but based on projections done by either expert forecasters or models of, under this swing versus that swing, how many votes will translate into how many seats. This was looking like a set of maps overall that were not strongly biased, that were either neutral or slightly biased to the Republican Party, but nowhere near as bad a playing field as Democrats had to face during the 2010s. Right. So that is one factor, right, that may have stemmed the bleeding, right? Reduce the wave to a droplet in some ways, right? Another potential factor is that what happened? Why did voters turn out in droves to vote against Barack Obama in 2010? What were they so mad about?
The Great Recession.
They were, yeah, you hit those two things right in the head. The Great Recession, right? That had dampened, but the ACA. Obamacare. He had the signature policy achievement, but it was something that made enemies. Right? Joe Biden doesn't really have that signature policy achievement, but what he's done hasn't made enemies. Right? His signature policy achievements are the Inflation Reduction Act. It really wasn't about reducing inflation, but it's a spending program for the environment that doesn't really penalize anyone. It just spends some of our it spends money on lots of environmental causes, and an infrastructure bill that was actually bipartisan. So what he did didn't lead to the grassroots Tea Party movement, didn't lead to the Harry and Louise commercials. Remember those against Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton? He didn't take big policy swings that led to a big policy reaction. And so I think that's another kind of undertold part of the story of why Democrats didn't lose big in this year. And then finally, I think Democrats and Joe Biden's party were saved by partisan polarization in America and party loyalty in America. And what that meant was that even if you were a Democrat, or a Democratic leading independent voter, because independent voters aren't really that independent, right? Many of them typically side with one party, and typically they just don't like to think of themselves as beholden. Right? You probably have friends like that. Independents and Democrats, independents who vote with Democrats and Democrats didn't abandon, and actually, according to polls, never abandoned the Democrats in Congress, even when they didn't approve of the job that Joe Biden was doing. Right? Joe Biden's approval first ticked down with the disastrous exit for Afghanistan. People didn't blame Congress for that. They blamed Joe Biden. And so that created a divergence where Joe Biden's approval rating went down, but Democrats are still 95% likely to vote for a member of Congress, and telling pollsters that. And then inflation rose. Joe Biden dropped further. But the projected vote for Congress, what people said, which party they said they'd vote for Congress, didn't drop. Republicans, it was the opposite of that. Even when some Republicans approved of Joe Biden, they were never going to vote for a Democrat in Congress, right? And the intention to vote among for Democrats in Congress was always just about nothing in Congress. For Joe Biden, it was just about nothing for Democrats, and so they had nowhere to drop when things turned south. And for independents, again, their intent to vote really diverged from Joe Biden. Their approval of Joe Biden went down, but their intent to vote for Democrats didn't drop that much, right? And what we've seen is this increase in party loyalty. So there's a statistic that Gary Jacobson, who's a longtime professor at UCSD, who's one of the nation's leading experts on Congress, always calculates, which is what percentage of people who voted for one party's president 2 years ago stick with that party in their congressional vote in the next midterm election. And that percent, when the Gingrich Revolution came and swept all the Democrats and swept for the first time in a generation Democrats out of power in Congress, that number was about 75%. About 3/4 of people stuck with their presidents. That means a quarter of people swung and voted for Bill Clinton in 92, for a Republican in Congress in 94. That set the stage for that massive loss. It was higher, the party loyalty was higher, but it was still about 90% in 2010. By the time you get to this year's election, based on pre-election polls, 96% of people who voted for Joe Biden said they're also going to vote that way for Congress. Right? Party loyalty. No matter what, no matter how the economy's doing, you just didn't see people abandoning a party because that other party, right, even if they don't like the job that Joe Biden's doing, that other party is viewed as really far from where they are ideologically. And as we've seen in study after study, we have such animosity for the other party. People think it would be bad for the number of people who said it would be bad for democracy if the other party was in charge. The number of people who say they wouldn't like it if their child married another member of the same a member of the other party. That gap, right? That emotional and cognitive as well as ideological gap that's grown between the two parties helped to insulate the Democrats from that big swing. So not only did it insulate them from a big swing in Congress, but if you look at the state legislatures, did Democrats lose 21 state chambers? Nope. Democrats, for the first time, had a good year in state government, and they took over 3 chambers. They took over both houses of the Michigan legislature. The Senate is tied, but they have lieutenant governor, so they cast a tie-breaking vote. So the Michigan House, the Michigan Senate, and the Michigan governor, Gretchen Whitmer, won a big victory. That was the victory where the concession speech came from, I think it's Tudor Mason, I think it's Dixon, thank you, her opponent, right? Minnesota, one of the houses flipped to make Minnesota have a Democratic governor, House, and Senate. Full control. And Pennsylvania, now the Democrats have what's called a trifecta, right? Full control. Why is that important? It's important. It signifies where Democrats have gone and what voters think of them. But it also sets the playing field for the 20. Those are all going to be battleground states in 2024, and states where groups allied with Donald Trump were interested in having the legislature pick a slate of electors to send to the Electoral College, even if they may not have won the votes, and that puts a Democratic bulwark, big capital D Democratic bulwark against that incursion on lowercase d democracy, right? It's not all good news for the Democrats in the state. If you look at state Supreme Court races, which we don't spend enough time thinking about them because we always forget that in many states you actually elect the state Supreme Court. Ohio and I believe it's North Carolina flip their Supreme Courts to Republican. And so they will likely be able to now redraw their districting maps in a way that vastly helps the Republican Party in the 2024 election in the congressional and state legislative levels. Because their courts, I think Ohio's Supreme Court had thrown out 6 times maps passed by the legislature because the Ohio State Constitution says it has to be fair on partisan grounds. That constraint, that judicial constraint, is now gone. So that's going to change things, and those are also the courts that may be ruling on some of the election law cases that may come through in 2024. Just because we always have election law cases that come through in the midst of a contested election. The Republicans were able to expand and get supermajorities in states like South Carolina, North Carolina, and Florida in the state legislatures, and that will help them move forward and continue the policy trend of red states getting redder and blue states getting bluer. But though Democrats lost in the South, they really regained ground in the Midwest. And that fits with constituencies that Democrats polled well with. Right? So Democrats have won elections in recent years by really pulling together a very diverse coalition of black voters, of Latino voters, and Asian American voters, as well as college-educated white liberals. Right? That's been the Democratic constituency. But Democrats have been the leading support among white voters overall. Right? Barack Obama, right, even in his triumphant re-election in 2012, did worse among white voters at 39% of the white vote than any Democratic candidate since Michael Dukakis. And then Hillary Clinton in 2016 did even worse, only capturing 38%. With Joe Biden, things ticked back up. I believe it was 39% from the exit polls in 2020. This year, Democratic congressional candidates got 40% of the vote from white Americans. Only won black Americans by about 86% to 14% margin. Won Latinos 60-40. So we saw in Florida, this was part of Ron DeSantis' big win, where he was able to flip Miami-Dade County and many of the Hispanic areas of Florida that are not just Cuban Americans, but also Mexican Americans, Venezuelan, Puerto Ricans. Republicans did better among Latino voters. It might be some of the explanation of why Republicans seem to be doing well in some surprising areas of California. So Chula Vista mayor's race, right? Where many people expected Amar Kampa-Najjar, now a familiar name in San Diego politics, and someone who had roots in Chula Vista. He lost to John McCann, and white Republican, and even in a very diverse city. And I think what that shows is the diversity of the Latino community in the nation and in California. This is a group that was often a 60-40 voting bloc in every election until Proposition 187. The 1994 ballot measure in California that would have denied any social services or school to anyone who was here without documentation. That clearly sent a signal that the Republican Party was anti-immigrant, and that killed the Republican Party for a generation and moved Latino voters in California to about a 70-25 Democratic voting bloc. That may be eroding. Right? Republicans in California are really focused on Latino small business owners and Latino middle class, and see courting Latinos as a route back to relevance, right? And how much conversation did you hear this year about immigration politics? It wasn't one of the Republican talking points, right? Republicans were that was what Donald Trump was all about. What really fueled his rise. And before that, Pete Wilson's political comeback in the 1990s in California. This was a huge part of the Republican Party's messaging, and it alienated many Latino voters. It also alienated Asian American voters who are now, a majority Democratic voting bloc. About 58% went for Democrats in this congressional race, right? But the Republican Party, either because they thought they had better issues this year to run on, with inflation, gas prices, crime, hasn't been talking about immigration. And I think that's part of why they've been able to do better with Latino voters and Hispanic voters in Texas and New Mexico and Nevada than they've done in recent years, especially in California, but across the nation. So Democrats have kind of cured some of their ills of the past by becoming relevant again to white voters, and that's opened up the Midwest back to Democrats and led to some historic gains. Republicans have had a friendlier message open to more Latino voters, and that may be why they did better in places like Florida and in many areas across the country. So we do have some shifting alignments as well as underneath the relative stasis of this race that didn't see a major flip. There are a million other things that I can talk about. I pay a lot of attention to California. We could talk about ballot measures. We could say, oh yeah, the one thing we didn't talk about in this election was that we actually had a gubernatorial race in California, right? And every other statewide ballot race. So did anyone remember, right? Or were you did you get to the ballot and say, oh yeah, we do have governors on the ballot, right? It was like this stealth race without any campaigning. Although I was kind of reminded of it, I was up in Sacramento actually working with, every year I get to train natural scientists to work in the state legislature. I was flying up there on Monday night. My flight was canceled, so I was like, all right, well, I got to go grab a burger at the airport. So I'm, crammed together in Terminal 1 Southwest. And I see some people at Senate District 1, so I start talking to them. That's the Senate District up in Northern California where Brian Daly is from. And I said, hey, your boss did a really good job at the debate. I watched that. Sorry it wasn't prime time, and and they said, oh well, you can tell him. So I went and spent and talked to Brian Daly and spent an hour with him hanging out at the San Diego airport. And he was someone who admitted who was very clear that Joe Biden had won the 2020 election, who distanced himself from Donald Trump's political style, although he said he agreed with him on policy counts. Who's really well respected in Sacramento, and someone who ran a pretty honorable campaign, but didn't make a ripple in the consciousness of California, because we're now absolutely a blue state, right? There hasn't been a Republican who's won a statewide ballot race since 2006. Right there, there will be very soon. I will be teaching students who weren't born the last time we had a Republican elected to office in California. So the Republican Party is looking for ways back to relevance, right? And I think changing their tune on immigration, focusing on some of these kitchen table issues that they may connect with voters on, focusing on education, and you saw some Republican wins in a few of the school board races, but certainly not all of them, not anywhere near the kind of the big gains that people thought we would see as a result of school closures. We didn't see many school board members endorsed by the teachers losing all across the state. So Republicans are still looking for that issue that will bring them back to relevance in California. I'd have to say I hope they do, because as someone who studies state politics and looks how it's changed over the last 150 years across all American states, one of the lessons is clear. So when two parties actually have to compete for voters, right? When they actually have to fight across party lines, build coalitions, stay what they stand for, when they actually have to hold debates that at a time that isn't during the Padres World Series playoff game, right? We get better policy, and that leads to better outcomes for Americans. I'm happy to show you the paper if you would like, but I think at some point the Republican Party will make some changes in California. Nationally, the Republican Party did not return to dominance, but we have a very competitive system. And over the next 2 years, we're going to see a lot of fights. Congress is going to move from a deliberative body to an investigative body in most areas, which is just what Democrats did in 2018 after capturing Congress, right? We may see another impeachment. Right? That's not surprising. It would be surprising. Democrats impeached twice after they captured Congress during Donald Trump's presidency. So we may see some of that. But remember, during that time of divided government, when we started off that 2-year term with a government shutdown, remember January 2019, which we may see more of that. We also had both parties come together and do an immediate COVID relief package that was massive, that provided a lot of financial relief for Americans all across the country during the height of COVID. We actually developed 2 vaccines with a lot of federal support that have proven to be among the most effective in the world. And for all those things that have gone wrong in American politics over the last several years, even during that time of closely contested partisan warfare that followed the 2018 midterms, Republicans and Democrats were able to get together and do important things during a sort of generational crisis. So I think there'll be a lot of rockiness, there'll be a lot of partisan fighting, but my main messages are I think we may have some policy agreement going forward, and we also saw an election go by that looked, touch wood so far, more like a normal election where losers conceded defeat and hopefully winners don't gloat, and we'll move forward to potentially a more normal 2024. But hang on to your seats, and we'll come back. All right, so as the league often does, let us know what the ground rules are, and let's converse.
All right. Yes. Write down your questions, pass them to Jane, and we'll ask them from up here. This is a recording device for our camera, so we will be talking from up here into this as if it's a microphone.
So we got a lot of questions.
Wow.
here.
Awesome. And before we get to these, will you just touch on measures B and C, because the league happened to endorse those two, and we're still wondering what's going to happen. They're both still within 1 percentage point.
So do you want me to predict what will happen here?
Well,
Do you want me to say how surprising it is?
I want to know with measure B, if it doesn't pass, what do you think's going to happen, or what do you think should happen?
B was trash, C was midway.
Yeah.
Well, what I think should happen is probably different than what I think will happen. Look, if this is overturned, I don't see much action on this, because when voters send a clear signal, politicians respect that. So I'm not sure when, it may need to wait a while before there's another run. With Measure C, if we want to build housing in California and make this an affordable state for my children to be able to stay in, and other people to be able to move into, and people to remain in their houses, we're going to have to build housing somewhere. And if an area like the Midway, right, which is not really the Midway District, which is not really one of the gems of single-family neighborhoods in San Diego, right, if there's enough NIMBY sentiment to stop housing projects in that area, I don't know where we can build. And I don't know how we'll be able to move towards the 3.5 million units of new housing that Gavin Newsom promised. And so the fact that wasn't, I know there are a lot of other aspects of that, and there are a lot of details of it that people focused on, but if you think of that as fundamentally, are we actually going to, in a place that's really meant for it, build some housing that will have these downward ripple effects of affordability? If we can't do it there, I don't know where we can do it.
Okay. So we have a question that was submitted. How would the election have turned out if there hadn't been the overturning of the Roe versus Wade decision by the Supreme Court?
Great question. This was this issue that, when the decision came out, many of us thought, well, this is a terrible thing. The silver lining is it'll finally resonate and motivate many voters to come and have their say in it. And I think, we did polling at the Yankelovich Center. We have a Yankelovich survey. We did a post-primary election poll right when Dobbs came out, where we randomly assigned half of our survey respondents to see an article about Mitch McConnell is considering a national abortion ban, right? Prime that in their minds, and the other half saw an article about the other issue of the day, which is Ukraine, right? Which was pretty important. But what we looked we looked to see how it would change, how getting that message about abortion rights would change their intention to vote. And what we didn't see was an overall change in people saying they're more likely they're definitely going to vote. What we saw was among younger voters, especially women aged 18 to 24 and 24 to 35, 25 to 35, we saw an increase. So among the people most likely to be personally affected by it, right, this did have a priming effect. I think there's kind of an analogy for what we've seen across the nation. I don't think it's swung elections everywhere. Probably not in New York, where Democrats had surprising losses and performed really poorly at the statewide level. But in Michigan, where all those gains were that I talked to you about, there was also a measure on the ballot to restrict abortion rights. So where things were actually in play, where abortion rights really could change that year, in Kansas, right, where there was in August, right, a ballot measure that people had fresh in their mind. Kansas reelected a Democratic governor. It's a super red state, right? reelected a Democratic governor. And so I think in places where voters really felt that reproductive rights were at risk, and could immediately act on it with a ballot measure, I think it did spur voters to the polls, but it didn't have this big, broad effect all across the country that quite led to the revolt that we thought we'd see.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, if Republicans take the House, what happens to the January 6th committee investigation?
Yeah, it's done. It's over, and so the committee will be dissolved. As in one of the postmortems that I read today, there's Republican pollsters saying, yeah, we knew these committee meetings would be a failure and that no one would pay any attention to them, but still that wasn't enough to stop us. That wasn't. We weren't hurt by them, but the continued focus on contesting the 2020 election results didn't help us. So it wasn't that January 6th really has been a negative for Republicans in their mind. It's that just focusing on the election being stolen wasn't a big positive for them. If you look at all the polling on the January 6th commission, what you saw was very few Republicans. No one was moving, even though Congress did this incredible job. No one changed their opinion, and that was partly because Republicans weren't watching. If you look at polling for Donald Trump, so Morning Consult have been doing a poll just about every month to see ask all Republicans, who do you want to be your next presidential candidate? And Donald Trump has beaten the entire field for the whole series, and usually it's over 50% of Republicans say Donald Trump. So his support is greater than all other Republican candidates combined. The only month he really dipped below 50% was their poll on January 9th, 2021. He dipped into the low 40s, and then by the next month was back up. So it really it was something that has been brushed off by many voters as this was, some people rioted, they were bad, but that was a weird thing. It had nothing to do with Donald Trump. It doesn't have anything to do with our it doesn't really threaten our democracy, and so I think so. But so regardless, even if the Democrats wanted to, you just can't keep the committee going without majority control.
Okay. What was the impact of crime on national election results?
Yeah, so crime wasn't a top of the mind issue for voters this year. If you look at the exit polls, about 31% said inflation, 27% said abortion was the biggest issue, and then crime was down there about 10% with a couple of other issues that are always kind of bubbling up but weren't the major issues of the day. And I think we've seen, if you watch Fox News, right, it's all about crime. And what you see over and over again is this rise in crime, skyrocketing crime, 30% increase in crime. And that's true. Right? They're not lying about that. Crime has risen because we are at an incredibly low baseline in 2019 and 2020. Right? Really 2019. Crime, America and California are much, much safer than they were when I was a kid, playing outside and with permissive parents, right? Crime rates are about 60% down still from what they were. Property crime rates peaked in 1980. Violent crime rates peaked about 92, 93. And when you look at that long term, I think people get a very different view of crime. So also in the Yankelovich survey, we did an experiment where we showed half the people the increase in crime over the last 2 years and asked them what they thought of our Attorney General, asked them whether they wanted to repeal Prop 47, which has gained a lot of currency. And then the other half, we showed the downward trend over 30 years and then the slight upward uptick. And what you see is about a 10 to 12 percentage point difference in what people think of the Attorney General, what people think about policy. And I think at the end of the day, most Americans still understood, right, that the crime is lower than it's always been. And so maybe that was why it hasn't been the Republican route to victory that many hoped it would be.
Okay. Any thoughts on why our Democratic governor opposed Prop 30?
Yeah.
Why he aligned with the Republicans?
Yeah. So this was this amazing proposition that had the Democratic Party on one side, Governor Gavin Newsom on the other hand. Some environmental groups on one side, some environmental groups on the other side. And I think it streamed together three narratives that are going on now in California politics, right? Or they've been part of California politics. One really worked in its favor. We have this consensus on addressing becoming the world leader in addressing global climate change, or at least the nation's leader, and doing that through technology, right? And so electric cars that Prop 30 would have funded the purchase of, especially for people who don't have the income now to buy Teslas. Electric cars are the most tantalizing thing because they're both environmental and super fun, right? So I have a Ford Mustang Mach-E, which is like, I love it because it is like, it is very self-indulgent. It's a sports car, but it's also self-righteous, right? It's a car for the climate crisis and for my midlife crisis, and so Prop 2030 was so tantalizing because of that. Right? It's this win-win on the environment and personal pleasure, but also another current and narrative in California politics is our increasing distrust of people buying the initiative process. Right? What also happened? Prop 26 and 27 spent $600 million more between them, more than any other ballot box battle we've seen in world history. That was like more than a presidential campaign cost 20 years ago, essentially. All right, and they both died. And part of that was people were like, well, I kind of like this thing's going to help homeless people. Well, who's behind it? Oh, these two out-of-state corporations who want a monopoly on gaming? I don't like that. Or, when you find out the source of money, there's a lot of good evidence that shows this. When you find out the source of money, people can become very skeptical. And learning that all the money was coming from one corporation made people think, wait, is this really going to help all of us, or is this really just for Lyft? And the third stream, excuse me for a second. The third stream in this is the narrative of California exodus, which is much exaggerated. We have a UCSD survey that shows this, and it's especially exaggerated that it's all the rich people leaving California. But people were worried that after ballot measure were taxed millionaires, right? That putting another, and I believe it was about a 2% tax on millionaires, would have just driven a lot of people across state lines into Incline Village, right? It would have kind of killed the golden goose of Silicon Valley and all the IPOs that have provided our $300 billion state budget and all that surplus, right? And so even people, I don't know how many of this in the room would have actually seen our taxes increased. You're probably somewhere a little bit fancier now if you were making enough money to see your taxes increase. But even some of us who weren't the millionaires are going to face this tax increase. We're a little bit worried about what it would do to the state overall and its budget if it drove some of them out of the state.
Makes sense. Okay, what do you think the debt ceiling will be the focus of partisan fighting in the coming months?
Ooh, that is a really good one, right? So the debt ceiling, this thing that we kind of forgotten about under unified democratic rule. This is Congress's way. So budgets are always this staring match, and when you have divided government where two sides need to agree, and the way to get leverage is to create a crisis. And what the debt ceiling does is it creates this, and what government shutdowns do is creates this crisis of, if we don't come to agreement, we're all going to pay this cost. And when the Democrats have the presidency, I think Republicans are going to say, we think people will blame Joe Biden if we don't get to the debt ceiling, if we approach the debt ceiling without an extension. And so I think you may see Republicans trying to play this sort of game of chicken. Of moving up to the debt ceiling. The problem with that for many Republicans is some of the groups who really hate the approaching the debt ceiling are businesses, and businesses and the stock market doesn't like that, and that's still a core constituency. No matter how much Donald Trump expanded Republican support among the white voters with high school educations, the Republican Party is still predominantly the party of the wealthy in California, in the United States, right? Voters making over $100,000 went majority for Republicans in this election, and went majority for Donald Trump in 2020, whereas voters making under $100,000 went majority for Democrats in this year, just as they went majority for Joe Biden. So there's still, Republicans still lean richer than Democrats, and that may place a constraint on the Republican Party's willingness to do this brinksmanship.
Okay. Many young people, maybe including your students, express frustration in the two-party system. What are your thoughts on how a third or multiple party system could actually be established or operate?
It can. Look, we're going to see. It's Andrew Yang and And is it former
Christy
New
Todd
Jersey
Whitman?
Governor Christy Todd Whitman? Very good. They're going to be the latest people to fail to create a third party in American politics. Part of this is lots of Americans actually like both parties. They like their party and really hate the other, right? There aren't that many Americans who are truly in the middle and truly looking for an Andrew Yang. And the rules of the game of American politics are just not set up for third parties, right? If you vote for a third party in this election, right? If you had voted for someone who wasn't a Democrat or a Republican in Congress, what would you be doing with your vote?
Burning it.
And that logic, right, is what drives people away from third parties. Now, third parties can have these minor effects. So, in certain conditions. So, Cassidy Reller is a PhD student who I work with here, who's on the job market. Has research showing that third parties in state legislatures, when they spoil elections, when they capture enough votes to ruin it, when the green person captures enough votes for the Democrat to lose to the Republican, or the Libertarian captures enough vote for the Republican to lose to the Democrat, the party nominates someone who's a little bit more extreme the next year. So they do help to pull parties to that gets people responding to those third parties, and they pull. It also makes American politics a little bit more extreme and polarized than we would otherwise have. But in general, it's just so hard to for any third party to break into the system, given the way the rules are written. You can change the rules with instant runoff voting. There's a movement to do that in San Diego, but there are other problems with instant runoff voting that we can talk through.
Okay, I'm going to combine two questions here. Do you think Trump is finished, and how fractured is the Republican Party?
Yeah. So one of the narratives that emerged on election night is this was all Donald Trump's fault. All right, who's Joe Biden? His approval's in the toilet. He's at 42%. But Donald Trump, he's at 41%. He's even worse, and maybe people were running away from Trump. So certainly the nomination of some fairly extreme candidates in a few key congressional races and a few Senate races and gubernatorial races, and Donald Trump played a hand in that. That hurt the Republican Party, right? In places like Pennsylvania and potentially Michigan. But Democrats were also part of that. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee playing in primaries to help ensure it's a very cynical strategy that's terrible for democracy, but turned out pretty well for the Democrats this year, and Democrats will try it again. So I think it's not all Donald Trump's fault. There's going to be a counter narrative that's going to emerge. It's probably circulating around Mar-a-Lago right now. That what happened in this election, and the reason the Republicans underperformed, was they didn't have Donald Trump on the ballot, right? And so there are these different competing theories. I think a lot of Republicans embraced Donald Trump, some of them holding their nose and voting for Donald Trump, because as they saw America getting more and more diverse and Democrats doing better and better with these groups, they thought that they were always going to be in the electoral wilderness. Donald Trump comes in, has this upset victory in 2016, and people thought Donald Trump is the only Republican who could win now. And that might have been true at that time, right? Ted Cruz wasn't going to do it, right? Rick Santorum in the sweater vest wasn't going to do it, right? Now, Joe Biden doing in the toilet, it's very possible that Donald Trump is the only a Republican who could lose the presidency in 2024, and that his chances are much lower than Ron DeSantis. But because of that, we're going to see a huge fight between Trump and DeSantis. You saw Donald Trump on Election Day essentially publicly blackmail Ron DeSantis and say if he runs, Donald Trump's going to tell people about all these secrets and skeletons in his closet. So that may cause a fracture, but I don't think it's going to be, but I think it's going to be one of those fractures that we see open up during a primary that usually heal by the time we get to the general election.
Okay. Why have key acts like CHIPS and other Biden policies not made a ripple in general public consciousness?
What do we like to... We had... Joe Biden could claim a lot of victories, but nobody really paid much attention to those, right? We talked about what the Supreme Court did and then essentially what the Fed did, right? Inflation, what the world market did to us, right? We're not talking about any of these policies. And I think none of his policies really hit at the things that you grow up debating and feel passionate about. How many of you, spent a lot of time debating infrastructure, right? Or what funding mechanism to use for climate change funding, right? None of these really hit at the salient debates of the day, and so part of the underlying premise of that question is, why didn't he get credit for these things? But part of the point I was trying to make at the beginning is he didn't get blamed for anything because he didn't trip over any big controversial policies. Joe Biden, Mr. Boring, it worked in 2020, and it may have been part of his key for survival in 2022.
Okay, since California is a deep blue state, why did the voters reaffirm Prop 209 2 years ago, which prohibits affirmative action racial preferences?
Yeah. So, because California's initiative process, unique among other states' initiative processes, requires that an initiative can only be undone by another vote of the people. We have a lot of policies that get stuck in time. Prop 13, right? 1978, stuck in time. And people always said, well, if voters just have the chance to vote on a revision to Prop 13 that protected residential units but not commercial units, and would bring in billions and billions of dollars for our schools that have been so lacking, they would snap that up. And Prop 209 passed in 1996 during a much more conservative era when California's electorate was 70% white. We kind of thought if voters just had another chance to revisit that, things would change. In the words of Joe Matthews, a great reporter who writes about California, because of our initiative process, we're governed by ghosts. Right? These old decisions passed in the past. But in the 2020 election, we got to revisit two of those. We got to revisit Prop 13 and Prop 15. And voters soundly rejected that change. And we got to revisit Prop 209 with Prop 16. And voters, even after this summer of in many ways awakening about social justice and the ills of it, the voters rejected it. And I'd say I was completely shocked, frankly. I didn't necessarily think that Prop 15 would win, but I thought Prop 16 would win. And I think you saw shifting alliances that reflect the fact that affirmative action today is not popular. It's not popular even among just about every racial and ethnic minority group, right? And Supreme Court is very likely going to undo the version of affirmative action that many universities practice, and in some ways that may be the Supreme Court restoring some of its credibility with the public, because even though I don't happen to agree with that, that is now a popular, getting rid of affirmative action is now a popular policy.
Okay, what happened to some Republicans running for Secretary of State and Attorney General in states that wanted to control elections more?
Yeah, so a good number of those candidates lost, so including Michigan. I haven't counted it, but I have the links to every newspaper. The Washington Post, the New York Times did a rundowns of election deniers and how they did in every election. And it's, one of the important things is Secretary of States really don't have a huge amount of power to manipulate election results. What you would need would be state legal changes to allow the legislature the power to elect a different set of electors. There's been an important guardrail of democracy set up against that with the Electoral Count Act at the national level being revised to make clear that what people were asking Mike Pence to do on January 6th was not constitutional. And so we're going to see exactly which states now with supermajorities like North Carolina and South Carolina, what they might do. Those are probably states that Republicans are going to win in the presidential race anyway. We're going to see if the Supreme Court adopts what's called the independent legislatures doctrine, which would take away judicial and gubernatorial oversight of what legislatures want to do in the electoral realm in states. And so if those two things happen, we may see some more opportunities for what we call electoral manipulation, which is elected officials not just doing a nonpartisan count of the vote of the people, but intervening in that. And that may change things, but right now we didn't see massive victories for all across. We only saw victories in states that were already going to be very likely Republican in 2024 overall.
Okay, I'm down to my last question. So if there are any more, okay, I'll come over and grab these. Do you think that strong party loyalty is due to more people listening to MSNBC and Fox?
So it's really hard. There are a lot. We have one trend to explain, which is America's gotten a lot more partisan and polarized over the last generation, and we have a lot of causes. Is it the echo chambers of our televised media? Is it the echo chambers of our social media, right? Which are also just as polarizing. Essentially, in some ways, a lot of that change came from correcting something that was actually really wrong in American politics, which was we had a lot of people whose party ID didn't match up with their ideology, and you actually couldn't tell sometimes who that person was who you were voting for and whether they were going to represent your interests. And political scientists actually used to rant and rave about the Tweedledum, Tweedledee parties in America in the 50s and 60s. The American Political Science Association put out a report called Toward a More Responsible Two-Party Government, where we wanted to have closed primaries and laws to allow kind of truth in advertising so that voters could know who they were voting for based on that party. And really the South, for very corrupt reasons, the South kind of made this corrupt bargain with the Democratic Party nationally until the 1960s. If you don't come down and enforce civil rights in the South, we'll continue voting for the Democratic Party in national elections. And that led a lot of Southerners to have Democratic partisanship, even if they were very conservative, and that carried through for a generation and didn't really correct until the 1990s, and some state legislatures until 2010. And so really what we just saw, what we see is polarization, which is Democrats are all pretty exclusively liberal and Republicans are all pretty exclusively conservative, was in some ways just we've always had a lot of conservative and liberal people, and now they pick the party that matched their ideology. Everything else that we've seen, such as Fox and MSC, is sort of an accelerant for that. But that realignment came for many good reasons, was the fundamental driver of that change.
Okay. What are your thoughts about the San Diego County Board of Supervisors District 4 redistricting map, which split the Chaldean community in El Cajon and Rancho San Diego?
Yeah. So every map splits some community. And I worked as a consult as an expert witness defending the Citizens Redistricting Commission statewide maps after the 2010 redistricting, and what you saw was that no matter which communities you kept together, lines have to divide someone, and whether it was UCSD being mad about being split apart or not, like you're always going to have some controversies. That is a community of interest, right? Chaldean community. There are many communities of interest, and every line is going to split some of them. I wasn't following the San Diego process closely enough to see what it was that why that community lost out and other communities were preserved together. But I know it's an essential fact of drawing lines on geography that those lines will always separate two groups of voters who feel that they're together. But here's the problem with keeping communities that are like-minded together, which is really what the state commission was doing in San Diego when it drew congressional lines. What happens when you keep communities interested, of people who really agree on things, and you keep them together in some districts? You get 4 congressional districts that are just completely safe for their incumbents, whether it's Darrell Issa in a safe red district in the East County, or Scott Peters, Sarah Jacobs, and Juan Vargas in completely safe districts here. If you keep communities that think together, you don't have political competition, and that leads to less political policy responsiveness.
Good point. All right, our last question, and I hope this is going to leave us on a hopeful tone, because it's about youth. Did pollsters underestimate the youth vote this election, and how will youth affect future elections?
Yeah, so I don't think we know quite what the youth vote was in this election. According to the national exit polls, about 11% of the electorate was young, compared to 28%, 65 and over. Right, and the youth vote curve, the voter turnout curve, where you see basically, turnout rises at every single age group until you hit about 75. But you see, you are the super voters of America, and that is more pronounced in midterm elections than general elections. And if you look at it across like the past 10 midterms, it's almost exactly identical in every midterm election. Where it is, where overall turnout is bumps up and down. It was much higher in 2018 for every level, but that turnout curve is the same just about every year. We don't have the final results for that for this year. It's gonna probably be a few months. But young voters have a bigger impact on presidential elections than they do on midterm elections. I'd have to say I was hugely, when I got over being upset, panicked about the lines at UCSD polling places, I was pretty proud, right, of how mobilized UCSD was and how many students wanted to turn out. And that's very true often on college campuses. But it's not true for college-age voters who are not in college, who aren't getting someone asking them to register to vote every time they walk across campus, and who aren't having all those opportunities. So a lot of what we've been doing at UCSD and the Yankelovich Center is doing research on what are the voting reforms that bring not just higher voter turnout, but a more inclusive electorate along racial and ethnic lines, along age lines, along education lines. So I've led a project called the New Electorate Project, where 10 faculty members at 5 different UC campuses. We spent the last 5 years working with the state legislature, with the Secretary of State's office, to study all these changes in California voting rights laws that have expanded the electorate to ensure that expands turnout for everyone. And Zoe Heinal, my co-director at the Yankelovich Center, has been doing work across the country on changing the timing of elections, where local elections that were segregated from presidential elections had much lower and much less representative turnout. California, based on his research, has now moved just about all those elections. So the LA mayor's race, instead of being in April of an odd year, is in November of an even year. It's going to bring a much bigger and broader and more inclusive electorate. King County in Washington just adopted them on Tuesday, that timing of local elections, and so did Boulder and cities across the country. New York is considering it, and all of those reforms are going to be the kind of thing that bring young voters, that bring Black, Latino voters, that bring less affluent voters to the polls to have their really important voice in American elections going forward. All right, thanks very much.
All right. Well, thank you very much. All right, Jane did our final words here.
Thank you so much. Here's a little token
Thank you so
monitor from the league.
Excellent.
And thank you all for coming out.